It's time for the letter of the day. This episode of My Seminary Life is brought to you by the letter omicron. Omicron is for Ameras, the letter omicron. Welcome back to My Seminary Life. I'm your host, Brandon Knight. In today's episode, as we continue our study of ancient Greece, we are going to be discussing the topic of classical literature from this era. Now, admittedly, I am not the most qualified person to talk about this topic. There are many of these classical writings that I did not have to read in high school. I got through all of high school without having to read anything of the Iliad and the Odyssey in particular, which we are going to talk about here today. So I brought in a ringer. I don't want to say expert. I don't want to maybe oversell, but a ringer. I brought in a ringer for today's episode to help me talk about classical literature. Ladies and gentlemen, making his My Seminary Life debut, Joe Scibbe. Joe, welcome to the show.
Hey, Brendan. Thanks for having me.
Is ringer a good description? Not an expert.
I'll do my best to live up to it. I just enjoy the texts, try to read them and understand them, ask what they have to say. And so we'll see how that goes.
All right. So since this is your first episode here, a little bit of an introduction for our audience listening today. First off, you are one of my many brothers-in-law.
True.
Actually, I don't know if I ever told you this. You were the one I was most nervous to meet. And it was something about the living in Germany. I had this idea in my head that you were very proper and very
okay.
Well, refound person, which one of the first times I saw you, you were wearing a bow tie. So
yeah, I don't know. Hopefully, I don't know if I lived up to or deeply disappointed all of your expectations.
Like I said, I think I've told you this before, and you're aware of this. You're Ron Swanson in real life. Maybe not as libertarian, but you are Ron Swanson. So. And that's a good thing to live up to.
Well, I appreciate it.
Of course. Along with that, all jokes aside, you call yourself a Christian humanist. So before we get into our discussion on classical literature and the Iliad and the Odyssey, I wanted to ask you a little bit about what that means, being a Christian humanist. So what is a humanist? And how does being a Christian influence that?
Sure. So humanism is a really interesting thing. I think when you talk to a lot of people today, if you were to tell them that you are a humanist, most people generally sort of assume that they are an atheist. That just contemporarily, those two sort of labels often live together. I am not. So humanism is a really interesting sort of tag or label. It's something that has existed for thousands of years. It's something that has been a part of Western culture. Unfortunately, a lot of times, due to lack of precise discussion and terminology, it gets a lot of times lumped in with things like liberal arts or other type of classical education or things like that. And they are fairly distinct from each other. They do have a lot of overlap and a lot of they're like little neighboring countries where kind of they blur a bit. But the humanities, I guess somebody that is a humanist is somebody who is attempting to understand the humanities, which is a bit of a cop-out answer. But so the humanities are Generally more on the literary side of the sort of the discipline. So when you think about liberal arts, a lot of times they get confused, but liberal arts, it's sort of some of the more foundational, I guess. Part of the problem is as these have been around for a few thousand years, uh, a lot of different definitions have been put forward. Different,
Okay.
there are like multiple different lists of what are like the liberal arts, right? We currently
Sure.
have like the trivium, the quadrivium, but that's not like a monolithic thing throughout history. And it's the same with the humanities. What
Okay.
are the humanities? But they're generally things history, literature, even within philosophy. Philosophy is humanist, kind of depending on how you define it. Generally, things like ethics and political philosophy. The humanities are
Mm.
things that help us to understand what it means to be human.
Okay.
And so, as great as things like geometry and astronomy are for understanding the world and our place in it and how it works, the humanities really focus on who we are as humans. How do we interact? How do we form lives together? So things like that. Those types of questions
Okay.
really form the sort of the base for the humanist type disciplines, and it goes back. I mean, people like Cicero sort of
Okay.
had a lot to say about the humanities and like how they form citizens, like their role as a Roman, all the way through to you've got Erasmus, who's like the father of the humanities, or I think that's either father of the humanities or Christian humanists.
Okay.
Um, and so like his one of his great emphases in the Middle Age, or the Middle Ages and the Renaissance era, however you kind of divide that, was the emphasis on languages, especially original
Mm.
languages. You see with the Renaissance and the Reformation, this call ad fontes, or ad fontes, however you want to say that, means back to the sources, right? As close as we can, we're
Okay.
trying to read and understand these ancient texts in their original languages as much as we can. I only have a tiny little bit of Latin, so it's not really necessary. Translation is great. Finding good translations for these texts is just really helpful for me and for all sorts of normal people who aren't professionals. But yeah, so it's primarily literary. It's a lot of it is trying to understand what it means to be human. How do we interact? How do we live? How do we, all of these different questions about our lives.
Interesting. I'm glad you started with this point of being a humanist is not equal to being an atheist, because like you said, that is often kind of lumped together. As a, I've been a Christian, I've been around the block for a while now when it comes to being a Christian, and the term secular humanist gets tossed around all of the time within evangelicalism as basically like the villain. Humanists are treated almost like the villain, the secularist humanist culture, all these kinds of things. But from my understanding of what you're saying here, to be a humanist, it's different from like anthropology or sociology, where maybe you're studying more like culture, understanding cultural behaviors. Humanism sounds more like, what does it mean to be a human? What does it mean? And particularly through like a literary lens. All these other things you talked about, some of the other liberal arts as well, mathematics, history, political philosophy, but like very specifically like literature, literary reasoning is how someone learns how to be human within your like framework. Am I close in understanding
Um,
that?
so I guess when I say literary, I mean books.
Okay.
So Aristotle's Politics and the Nicomachean Ethics are just as much humanist inquiries as um, the Iliad and the Odyssey,
Okay.
or like the works of Tolkien, right? The things that, even
Okay.
to the modern, um, you Flannery O'Connor and whatnot. So
Mhm.
it's mostly just like writing of these works. So not things like, not that mathematics and natural science aren't written, but um, so
They're
literary
more
meaning like
theoretical. They're like more
uh,
theoretical stuff.
kind of. Yeah, it's a really difficult sort of thing to, so especially like trying to make clean lines
Sure.
between the disciplines, and is really difficult. Like, where does philosophy end, and where does myth, or where does
Begin.
history end and where does myth begin, is a question it's much harder to answer, I think, than a lot of people are willing. We just kind of say, oh, that's myth, right? The Iliad is myth. And well, is
Hmm.
it? Or Herodotus is history. But those questions are a lot more complex.
Hmm.
Than I think often get credit.
Real quick on that point, just before this episode, I sat down with a guest to review the movie 300 as a way to talk about like our interest in Sparta and look at some of the accurate moments, inaccuracies within
Hmm.
the movie to the ancient culture. But we did talk about how with Herodotus and all these other ancient historians, it is sometimes hard to tell when is it fact and when is it almost propaganda or legend or myth to tell these stories. So yeah, I get what you're saying of like there's some clean cut lines, but like you can't make like a very like it's not in a box, I guess is what I'm
Hmm.
saying. How does being a Christian influence that? Other than Jesus, how does being a Christian guide being humanist?
Sure. So, um, I mean, when you open the Bible, you can't get past the first, I mean, probably page or two, depending on how it's laid out, without finding humans. Right, on the sixth day,
Mm,
God creates, male and female. He created them in His image, and there's like part of this humanist tradition is looking at that and trying to understand what that means, right? Like, not
mm,
just from the scriptures, like what is Genesis, what is the author of Genesis telling us makes humans unique, but then um, trying to understand that there is, as a Christian, one of our sort of, I would say, fundamental understandings is that there's something distinct about humans from the rest of creation.
okay.
But then what is that, and how does that work, right? So in the, like in the beginning is in Genesis, but like in the beginning, right, there's, humankind is given the um, charge to rule over creation, to act over creation. And so, like, what does that look like, this idea of governing? Or so you want to talk about political philosophy? Some people talk about, oh, well, politics is only necessary after sin enters the world. And I guess
Mm,
it partly depends on how you define politics, but I also think God is giving humans a like this, like, charge over creation, and even without like sin in the world, like, there would be this necessity to live together and to understand how to make laws regarding how we interact and all sorts of things. So a lot of it has to do with, this charge that humans have over creation, this special position that humans have in creation, and trying to understand that, trying to work that out in a lot of different ways. Right, the scriptures uh, truly are sort of. I think it was Martin Luther who said they're the norm of all norms. Like, everything goes
mm,
back to that, and we test all of our ideas against that. But the scriptures aren't exhaustive; they don't tell us everything that we need to know. Um, and so, at least I would say that. If your readers want to light someone on fire, they can come for me, and leave you alone. But I mean, I think that's, and I mean, the scriptures also exist within a certain context. The ancient Semitic world, all the way through to the Roman Empire, at its very beginning. So, like, these are situational things, that the stories we're seeing in um, the history of Israel, as they move through their covenant with God. They exist within a certain time and place, and that's not exhaustive, right? I mean, none of us
mm,
are shepherds, so to talk about, the Jesus is even an example of the shepherds there's a lot that we ought to learn from that, from the teaching of Jesus. But at the same time, sometimes it's difficult to really inhabit a world that we don't, and so being able to read and to understand those and try to retell some of these stories about our humanity in different ways, try to understand how we interact, how we deal with ourselves as people in ways that aren't directly addressed by the scriptures, but still try to measure by the plumb line of the scriptures is really, I think, a major sort of through line for the Christian humanists.
All right. All right. I like that's it. That's a very good answer because I mean, I don't know why I'm judging if it's a good answer or not. You should be the judge of if your answer is good or not. But basically, being a Christian humanist is looking to scripture for the answer, but understanding that it's in places a very cultural answer. It's a very time restrained answer. And so we need to be open to studying what it means to be human outside of scripture as well, but always coming back to it as like what keeps us aligned. Would you say that's a good
Yeah,
summation?
I think that's true. I mean, part of it is just, I mean, we all do this, you know.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's there's this quote. I think it's from like Marcus Aurelius, who says, "You know, don't argue about what it means to be a good man; just be one." And I think
Mm.
about that. I'm like, well, that's absurd, right? Like, you can't. I can't be a good man. I can't be a good person unless I know what it means to be a good person. Like
Sure.
you say, like, okay, hey, I need you to drive to the destination. And you go, okay, I don't know where the destination is. It doesn't matter. Just drive there. I'm like, okay, well, that's not helpful. These are all questions that we're trying. Like, we all want to be. Maybe I shouldn't say all. The vast majority of human beings want to be, you know, good, decent people. We
Sure.
all want to live in communities that are safe. Like some of these are like fundamental like human desires. Um, and there's this sort of trend to say like, oh, like Christians, they have prior convictions, and so we can't really necessarily we you know we don't need to honor that because they're coming in, they're not objective, uh,
Mm.
and yet I find that to be uh, exclusionary, and I don't think it's just like, oh, we need to be like critical thinkers and objective, like think for yourself. And I think, well, we all carry in our prior convictions about things, right?
Sure.
I mean, I think even to say that human beings are special and valuable is a prior conviction that Christians have, that I think is a good
Mm.
thing. That isn't necessarily an objective thing to say. You can't like say this as an objective
Mm.
reality
Okay.
to like, everybody doesn't believe that, right?
Sure.
This sort of like, uh, it's hard because like what a lot of these words mean, right? What is objective? What is subjective, right? Like you talk to
Mm-hmm.
David Hume, he would say like you can't mathematically prove it, and so you can't. It doesn't really. I don't know. So, but part of it is just recognizing that like as Christians, we have something to contribute to this, to the discussions about our communities, our lives, our humanity. We do come in with priors, and that's okay. That's good. We need to do that, right? You shouldn't. I'm not. I don't ask anybody else to check their convictions at the door. Just like I would
Mm.
not expect anybody to ask me to do so. But to still be honest and to try to seek the truth through that, and to do so together.
So, listeners, if you can take anything away from this already really great first 20 minutes of this episode, take this to heart. If you hear someone's a humanist, don't panic. Get to know the guy first, get to know the gal first, and you might discover all they're trying to do is just better understand what it means to be human. Let's get now into the literary side of things. You mentioned a few of these works earlier. We're going to talk more specifically about the Iliad and the Odyssey here in a moment. But what is classical literature? What's the typical reading list of a humanist? What's our top 10 greatest hits here in your genre?
Yeah, this is one of like the sort of the wars that goes on all the time. Is what is in the canon, right? Everybody likes to argue about what is in the canon. What is classics? It's always funny when you
Hmm.
scroll through like I'm on TikTok to my own shame, but you see people like, oh, here are some classics, and they'll like put up Ernest Hemingway or they'll put up Virginia
Hmm.
Woolf or something like that, and you're like, okay, that's those are great things to read. But it all depends on how we define classics. So I'm certainly not like the one person to do so.
Sure.
A lot of times when people say classical literature or the classical world or classical antiquity or things like that, what they generally are meaning are like the ancient Greek and Roman world.
Hmm.
So you're gonna from I guess with like the Iliad and the Odyssey, some of those, or like works and days like the early Greeks like Homer, all the way through I guess through to the downfall of the Roman Empire and the
Hmm.
Western Roman Empire in the 400s. Um, so, I mean, classical oftentimes refers to that. So things that are written in Greek and classical Latin. Um, but it's a really it's not like a it's not a question that has like a distinct like answer. It's because there are some things that can be considered like classics but not classical. So you know
Gotcha. Interesting. So when you broadly speaking, when you're using the phrase classical literature, you're looking at like broadly speaking the Greek Empire all the way through to the fall of the Roman Empire, which would be roughly like what 900 years worth of potential books you could be reading,
Yeah, something
something like that.
something like that. Yeah, it's I mean it's a fairly large sweep
Okay.
of things. So there's it's people say, oh, the classical author said this. I'm like, well, which ones? Who are you talking about? Even I mean, broadly, the Greeks and the Romans have dramatically different understandings of well, the world and how you live in
Mm.
it and how you form societies. So it would be like saying Americans think this, and then they like you know they Americans think hamburgers are great, and then you're like, well, what about George Washington? That guy never ate a hamburger in his life. But like we're both like so it's just a really big topic to try to understand that doesn't reduce very well.
Gotcha. Okay. So, and that would include things from, you talked about earlier, like some of the philosophical works would be included in this. So, like Plato's Republic, Aristotle's Ethics, these would be some of the things you would tip. If I was going to go get a degree in the humanities, would that be some of the books I would be reading? Not that you're
Yeah.
working on a degree in the humanities.
Well, so I did my undergrad in the humanities, and I'm doing an MA in liberal arts. So it's one of those
Okay.
things where you're like the those. I'm actually also to my great shame, I'm not doing the mathematics segment as an MA student. I wish I'd planned better to be able to do that, but so yeah, as an undergrad, we read all sorts of things, everything from Homer and Hesiod to um, the rest of the some of the Greek playwrights, all the way the Romans with Cicero and some other his like contemporaries and things like that, all the way through to the medieval world. Augustine has that weird sort of like right on the line between the ancient and the
Okay.
medievals, and Thomas Aquinas, all the way through to like to Shakespeare, who is very modern, at least
Hmm.
especially compared to some of the others. But then it took reading Flannery O'Connor and all the way through to works that are published within the last 50. So yeah, it's another one of those questions like what do we mean by classical versus the
Okay.
humanities? Because the
Gotcha.
humanities I think is much broader than the classics.
With the humanities, liberally speaking, what's the cutoff? If the classical period is liberally speaking the end of the Roman Empire, what is it, liberally, broadly speaking, for the humanities? Like, the 1950s? Am I reading
Um,
Tolkien and calling
yeah.
it quits? Or
No, I mean, the humanities will end when humanity itself ends, or humanity itself stops thinking. I mean, it's an ongoing. To be fair, this is how I think about it. So you'll find other authors and thinkers who are much smarter than me who will tell me how wrong I am. But the humanist disciplines are things that we still contribute to today.
okay,
Um, you know, I mean, it's stuff that we have. A lot of these things seem like they're solved. Okay, well, democracy is good. And you go, okay, well, what do you? First of all, like, are you sure? What do you mean by that? Like, who gets? I mean, sometimes people ask those in disingenuously, but sometimes like you have to like, well, like we've thought this for a long time. Like, are we still sure about that? And so these are ongoing questions we ask today, tomorrow, hopefully, 100 years from now. I don't. Whenever the kingdom comes, I mean, hopefully the humanities continue even after that.
Hmm.
If everything ends at the resurrection and we kind of just like have nothing, no intellectual life for ourselves after that, I think that would be a dramatic downgrade for humanity. I think God made us with minds to think and to reason, and I think
Hmm.
it would be. Um, I won't. I don't think that God would expect us to put that all aside once
Hmm.
the new creation comes. I think this will continue as long as humanity exists.
All right. Continue as long as humanity exists. So once either the robot overlords take over and Terminators are running this place, or if society starts looking a lot like the movie Idiocracy, then we need to start worrying. Let's talk. Let's talk Iliad and the Odyssey now. Uh, so who's this Homer guy? Or I think I looked it up. Omeros. Who's this Omeros guy or Amoros guy?
We can call him Homer. That's the name that I know him by. So that's you could be cooler than I am and call him by his Greek name. I'm just gonna.
And he
Um,
lives on Evergreen Terrace in Springfield, but I don't know which Springfield.
okay, yeah, I don't think anybody does. I think that's part of the point. Well, I mean, that's to be fair, that's part of what one of like part of Homer's lore is that there's really not a whole lot of biographical information about Homer. There's even, I guess, question about whether Homer was a real person. What was so I don't know. One of my sort of annoying things is I don't care that much. Right? It's the same thing with like Shakespeare.
Okay.
Like, oh, who's the real Shakespeare? Like, I don't care. Are the plays good? Are they interesting? Are they enjoyable? What do they have to? What do the plays say? Is I think more important than whether Homer was one person or multiple people or whatnot. But ostensibly, Homer was an ancient Greek poet. Tells these stories. There are other things that we have from Homer, um, like Homeric hymns,
Hmm.
which I have not read but want to. But so these two great sort of foundational stories, the Iliad, which is the story of a portion of the Trojan War, and then the Odyssey, which is the story of Odysseus attempting to return home following that. So that's
Okay.
sort of very broad what those two are.
Okay. So Homer, we'll stick with Homer. I've heard this debate before. I think it was on an episode of The Art of Manliness about whether or not it was one person, multiple people, but when we understand ancient mythology, like this stuff was passed around orally for so long that it probably has multiple sources, even if it was all written down by one guy. At least that would be my understanding.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, even like the advent of writing would have come later than some of this, I think. So at least like formalized.
Mm-hmm.
It definitely was the part of the difficulty with reading the Iliad and the Odyssey is they are they're not songs, but they're sung poems, right? There's rhyme
Mm.
in like the ancient Greek that doesn't really necessarily translate well to English, and there's all sort of stuff that's very strange. But it was performed. It wasn't just
Mm.
it would have been really strange for the vast majority of human history for one person to just sit down in a quiet room and read the Odyssey for a couple of hours.
Huh.
That is an anomalous way to interact with it. So in a way, watching the movie Troy is closer to the that may be
Oh,
too much.
okay.
That may be too far. But like there's something to that it was performed, it was passed around, it was done in different places all over the ancient world, Greek world.
So is it better to understand this as a play then? Like we should think of this as a play rather than, strictly speaking, a book of poems or something?
Well, I don't. It's not really a play in that like there are characters, but they're not like portrayed by different actors on a stage. It would have been
Hmm.
a guy standing up, or I don't really know like how exactly how like women might have done it, but a person standing up in the middle of people and saying, "Sing, O muses of the rage of Achilles, the son of Peleus." Obviously in some sort of like an incantation, and it would have been much easier to remember that way as well because these are hefty works. So it would have been more akin to, I mean, I guess like a really, really long sung monologue, um, than I
Interesting.
guess uh, like a play as we might know it.
This kind of reminds me. I don't know if this is a good comparison or not, but it kind of reminds me of how we should actually be reading the epistles in scripture, because we've gotten such into the habit of like, okay, here's this paragraph, I'm going to read this paragraph of verses, or I'm going to read this chapter or this heading of verses, where in reality they're letters. So how they would have most likely have been read is out loud by someone who could read all at once to everybody that was there. And that's really how we should more so be interacting with that form of literature as well.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think more, especially Protestant churches. As a Protestant, I'll take shots at my own.
Oh,
Like
we do
we,
that all the time here. Go right
yeah.
ahead.
Oh, good. Yeah, I think one of the like I don't know. Growing up, I heard like, oh, the Catholics don't read the Bible, and I'm like, well, we only read like four verses at a time. So, like, I mean, none of these are. I shouldn't say none of Romans and the Corinthian verses or letters are pretty long. Like once you get into
Mm,
like Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and
sure.
and on, they're short. They're fairly short, a few pages long. Just have somebody stand up and read it. Even if it's just at like the beginning of a sermon series. Um, just take a couple minutes, read the whole thing, try to understand that this is all one cohesive work, right? So that way you don't get
Hmm.
to, I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength and go, aha, see, I can do whatever I want. And you're like, no, my guy, that is not what Paul is trying to say. And you would know that if you had read like any of the stuff that's around that, you would have picked that up. So yeah, reading the scriptures in larger chunks, trying to understand that these are not. I mean, even just breaking them down by verses can kind of make it more difficult to really get that they're not like isolated statements, that they really do work together.
Sure. Sure. Okay. So now on with the works themselves.
Okay.
You gave like this nice succinct, Iliad is about the Trojan War, Odyssey is about Odysseus returning from war. Okay, like I said, I'm pretty sure I didn't have to read any of this in high school, maybe like one section of it. I went to a small Christian school, and we can poke fun at small Christian schools all day long if we wanted to, but one key thing to understand that's different between a Christian school and a public school is how English classes work. The public school system focuses more on literature. The Christian school system focuses more on grammar. And there's reasons for both. We don't have to get into them unless you want to. So here's all the fragmented stuff I know about the Iliad and the Odyssey, and you can help me figure some of this out. So there's a war against Greece and Troy because of a woman named Helen or Helena, and Achilles gets shot in the ankles, and something about a wooden horse that's in every movie. And that's really it. That's really all I know about what's going on in these books. So what am I missing here? Can you maybe provide a little bit of context as to what is going on in these books.
Sure. Yeah. So actually, in all reality, the Trojan horse and the death of Achilles don't occur in the Iliad. Those are elsewhere to be found.
Oh, okay.
But and so yeah. So I guess back so the Trojan War began. There was a wedding, and this is what I think is, and I might be totally wrong about this. But if I'm not, this is really interesting. That the wedding is between uh, Peleus and Thetis, who happen to be the parents, right? Peleus, the human father, and Thetis, the divine mother of Achilles. So they
Okay.
have they get married. All the gods are invited except one, who is like the goddess Discord. Discord, as you can guess by her name, doesn't like this and tries to sow discord at the wedding. So you get this, like the story of the. To be fair, this is not really recounted fully in the Iliad either. But she throws
Okay.
this golden apple into the wedding, and on it is written like "to the fairest." And so there's this question between Hera, Aphrodite, and Athena as to like which of us three is the fairest goddess, right?
Hmm.
They want to be it. All three of them want to be it. So they each promise something different to Paris, who is the son of Priam, the king of Troy, and um, Paris chooses Aphrodite because she promises him the love of the most beautiful woman in the world,
Hmm.
who unfortunately happens to be Helen, the wife of Menelaus, the king of Sparta. And
Okay.
so, which is a problem, right?
Sure.
There's different opinions as to how willing and how much Helen wanted to go, but regardless, Helen is in Troy, and then so you said like the Greeks, which is a very modern term, right? Like the sort of what we see as Greece today. That whole peninsula would have been divided up into much smaller like kingdoms, and so there's a
Hmm.
lot of like when you see like there's a lot of kings that are fighting alongside each other, uh, coming together to try to sack Troy, and we pick up with the Iliad in like the last like 9 something years into the Iliad. So that's where we get.
Hmm.
Um, so that's where it starts. Is almost this 10 year war.
Oh,
We're picking up well into the war. Like the stalemate, the sort
gotcha.
of Greek. I'll just say Greek because it's easier that way. The
Hmm.
Greek forces, all the allies together, have been stymied, unable to um, really make any real progress. And so the book begins with the very famous line, "Sing of the rage of Achilles, the son of Peleus," and it goes on and on. It talks about how like this is like the downfall of many of the Greeks, and so it talks about some of the squabbles between Achilles and Agamemnon. Who like Achilles is mad about being dishonored by Agamemnon, who stole his prize. So he decides to actually sit out a good portion of the rest of the book. So for most of the fighting, you actually don't get Achilles.
Hmm.
So yeah, that's I mean, well, I'll come back to that here in a bit. But so there's all this. It goes on with all this slaying back and forth. The gods are getting involved, and with humans, and then fighting each other, and humans are fighting each other, and the gods as well. So there's all sorts of fighting going on. Eventually, sort of climaxes with like a pre-climax with um, the death of Patroclus. The um, uh, guess it depends on how you read it. The uh, very close friend or lover um, of Achilles. Um,
Ah.
Achilles finds this highly distasteful because he loved Patroclus, and so he decides to go into and rejoin the war. He goes, and there's eventually this ultimately climactic battle between him and Hector. Spoiler alert: Achilles wins. He drags the
Okay.
body of Hector around Troy for days and days, until eventually the gods have to intervene and tell him to stop. Priam comes out of Troy and asks for the body back, and then there's like the funeral of Hector, and that's the end, right? Like the war
Oh,
is
okay.
still going on even at the end of the Iliad. So it's still and it's a fascinating. That's way too much of an overview for that, but it's a fascinating thing because there's so much going on in there. I mean, there's a lot of like blood. It's extremely graphic language.
Okay.
I mean, like you really can get a very clear picture of what's going on with some of the fighting from the way that Homer describes it.
Yeah, I've noticed that censorship was not a thing back then because, like I said last week, we talked about 300. We've also have done a review. I had a couple guests on to review the 1981 film Clash of the Titans to kind of have that conversation of Perseus and like Greek mythology in general. And man, that stuff it's a soap opera once the gods start getting involved with stuff. Like, it's just,
Yeah,
it's graphic, it's unsettling, it's everything. And Greek culture, as you said earlier, just kind of broadly that using that term Greek culture back then was just, it was different to say the least.
yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, it's true, and it's fascinating because that's a critique that of the gods, especially that exists from even some of like the pre-Socratic philosophers, that they're like, oh, these
Mhm.
gods suck, all the way through to Augustine at the beginning of his City of Gods, or the City of God. He says something to the effect of like, well, like your gods are absolutely immoral. They're like heinous actors. Like they do terrible things. Like why would we listen to their moral judgments about anything? And
Mhm.
so like that, this, one of the things with, sort of the cultural background that we have today is you think of God as this, like, even if you're not Christian, there's this general assumption that God is supposed to be moral. God is supposed to be good and
Mm,
supposed to be just.
sure.
And so like some of that, but like the gods here are very much not, they're very human as well. Even the gods have a lot of very human characteristics.
Interesting. So that's the Iliad. So who's this Odysseus guy? What does he have to do with anything? You didn't mention him at all in the other book. So
No, but
take us
he
broadly through the Odyssey now.
yeah. So Odysseus does show up quite a bit in the Iliad. He pops up over
Okay.
and over and over again. Um, he's described as being very like clever, very witty, very intelligent. Um, so he plays a lot of a part in helping plan, not in the Iliad, but he's like I believe the principal, like creator of the Trojan horse. Like that whole idea to get inside
Oh,
Troy
okay.
was, I believe, Odysseus's idea. So he is. What I like Emily Wilson's description at the very beginning of her translation of the Odyssey, says, "Sing of a complex, complex or complicated, either complex or complicated man," and you really do get like, because I've been reading this for class, and one thing that we talk about is like, what does it mean to have glory? And you would think that Odysseus, I mean, essentially has one of the greatest and most long-lasting stories is his name. Essentially, it's named after him. You would think that that's glorious, but there's a whole lot here that we can ask questions about. What does glory mean? But this is his. So he's been gone for 10 years in the Trojan War, and now he takes another 10 years to get back home to
Wow.
Ithaca, which at the beginning you find out like everybody else is home. All the rest of the survivors of the Trojan War have made it home, but Odysseus has been waylaid by the gods, particularly Poseidon, who is not happy
Hmm.
about the way that Odysseus put out the eye of his son, the Cyclops. But like, so that's a fairly famous story. He puts out the eye of the Cyclops, who happens to be the son of the god of the sea, and so there's a lot of Odysseus being like pushed around the Mediterranean, all sorts of
Hmm.
different hijinks and adventures that he and his slowly dwindling crew get into, before eventually he does find his way back home and has to essentially reconquer his own home.
Hmm. Interesting. So when it comes to both of these works, we'll start with the Iliad and the Odyssey specifically. Um, why, if if you're a humanist or a Christian humanist, I get the impression that this is sacred text in a way. Like this is something you're supposed to read. But why would a guy like me or some of the listeners who aren't humanists, we are Christians, but maybe we're not humanists, what is the benefit of taking the time to read these two hefty books?
Yeah, so I think that any book that can be considered worth reading is one that couldn't possibly be reduced to its SparkNotes plot summary. Like if all
Okay.
you knew about a book was its plot, and you were like, okay, good enough, then that's not at all. So like I gave a very broad understanding of the Iliad and the Odyssey, and so if you walked away, like if you could, like you, but that doesn't really get at all into what's going on in these books.
Sure.
So that what some of the questions that they're asking, some of the situations they're raising, some of the the various ways that they tell these stories really challenges the way that we ought to think about the world, our lives in it. Um, so I'll come back to this. So back to plot. What I found
Mm-hmm.
interesting on this read through of these books that I just did, or in the middle of doing it now, is Homer doesn't seem to respect the idea of spoilers. So
Oh, okay.
so in the Iliad, right? You get multiple times you're told exactly what's going to happen. Like there's a prophecy about exactly how Patroclus is going to die. That's going to enrage Achilles, and Achilles is going to kill Hector. Right? Like you're like, okay, this is
Oh,
the plot of the book, and Homer's giving it to you well before halfway through. And even in the Odyssey, right? You're not even done with the first book, the first, like the introduction to the book, where it says Odysseus is going to try to get his men back home safely, and he's going to fail. And so, like
oh,
from the very beginning, you're disabused of this, like, and there's no suspense, there's no tension. You know that Odysseus is going to fail. So again, it's
hmm.
not just about the plot; it's about what it's like a lot about like how it's telling the story. What are some of the situations that people are ending up in? What does some of the language tell us? Um, but so back to your question about why should we care? Because
Hmm.
theoretically, none of us are going to stab each other with bronze spears. But I
I
do think,
hope not.
yeah, I hope so too. But so we do face similar types of questions in our lives, so similar situations. So one of the great, a famous sort of device in the Iliad is the choice of Achilles. He's told
Mm.
before he leaves for the Trojan War, you have a choice between two fates. Which, first of all, a human getting to choose their fate is wild.
Mm.
But your two fates are you can go to Troy. You will gain immense glory, and your name will be known through the ages. But you will die in like on the field of battle in
Mm.
Troy. Or you can stay home and you can live a long life and you will be forgotten on your death. Like like that's his
Oh,
choice.
okay.
And Achilles chooses to go to Troy, and he chooses to fight. And I mean, I think it's fair to say he has won glory down through the ages, with like his name being passed on. We're still talking about him, more than 2,000 years later. That's a pretty big deal. But
Hmm.
so it's the same question. It's not nearly the same stakes, but a lot of like we have similar questions today. Like I imagine somebody, so like it's fairly well known that like the president of the United States, like that ages you dramatically more
Hmm.
than like just not being the president of the United States. So there's kind of like would so like not as somebody who will never be faced with this choice, like will you choose to run for the presidency of the United States, knowing that it will adversely affect your life, but you can win glory and fame, you can do great things, or will you stay home and do live a normal life and get to live longer, right? So this quite this
Hmm.
the choice between glory and longevity is a question that we maybe don't all face, but a lot of people are going to encounter. And so it's something definitely worth considering. Why is Achilles choosing this, right? And we sort of, not to be, I'm not going to place any judgment on it, but like during the pandemic, right, we faced similar questions along that. Okay,
Mm.
do we gather together, in any way, shape, or form, and experience the richness of human community, or do we stay home, and like have our food dropped on the stoop and like never talk to people until this all goes away, and get to live a little bit longer, right? So that's like a legitimate question that
Hmm.
a lot of people had to
Sure.
answer, and a lot of people had very varying answers to that. How do they do that? And it's hard, to make blanket judgments about how people did certain things. Like I do think that there's a way to look at it and say that was a foolish choice to do such and such thing. But also there are other people, like, churches. How important is it to gather together as a church? And so like that's a question, and it's something that reading through the Iliad and trying to encounter that world, through that story, can help us to think about that.
That's a very interesting question to wrestle with too. This idea of glory or longevity, because I don't think we normally think in terms of that. I don't think you brought up a very good, very recent time where we all had to process that question with the pandemic. But it makes me wonder if as Christians, we often run to the do the thing that brings God the most glory, which maybe you can kind of work that into this question as well. But this idea of glory versus longevity in your decision making, I wonder how that would change how we make decisions. You know what I mean? Like if we thought in terms of what is good, because either way, both of them are working distant. You're making a decision now that's going to affect you in the future. And if you choose longevity, in the very long distant future. So to wrestle with that question and to use a work like the Iliad, where you might not get the answer you're looking for, or be put into a situation that's going to be very like one-to-one comparison type of thing. But it makes me wonder like how we would change as people if we thought more in those terms of, do you want longevity or do you want glory, or whatever term works better for you?
Mhm.
Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think so. There's a book by Alan Jacobs he wrote called "Breaking Bread with the Dead," and he said that one of the great benefits of reading older texts is that, we can like see the world and inhabit the world a bit through people who see the world and inhabit the world dramatically differently than we do.
Mm.
Just the sort of basic fundamental assumptions about reality, about community, about what makes a life worth living. These are all things uh, that Achilles would have answered in much different ways than I do, and that doesn't make
Hmm.
everything he says right or everything that he says wrong, and it doesn't make everything I think right or everything wrong. It's just, I think C.S. Lewis called it chronological snobbery. Like we look back and go, "Oh,
Mm.
these idiots didn't understand tidal functions, and so they clearly can't have anything to say about how we form communities." They also say that, unfortunately, like reading books by people in the future would be beneficial. We simply don't have those yet, and so we're sort of stuck with people from the past. But they, you know, for better or worse, like we're all human. So
Hmm.
that's again back to the humanities. Like we're all human. These are human stories. Like I said, even the gods they're fairly human stories, um, and so, listening to with intellectual humility, listening to the way people answer questions differently than we do, right? Like, so yeah, I mean, there are a lot of people who chose, and to the vaccine and
Hmm.
boosters and masks and isolation and distancing. So like there's a choice being made there, right? Like
Yes.
you're always sort of, I think as Christians, one of the difficult things is we tend to sort of say that we're choosing between good and evil. which is not
Hmm.
necessarily the case. A lot of times these are choices between two goods, and it's not black and white which one is the correct answer, right? Like what level of safety is the right one, and it's not obvious all the time. But we're making these choices, and we're also meeting people from the past who are telling us something about how they made those same choices, uh, again in different circumstances, but they're making very similar choices, and we ought to learn from them. We ought to be just
Hmm.
like shut up for. So as much as like it's good to come with your own questions, it's also good to just kind of shut up and listen to what the author is saying for a little bit, and to actually like to honestly interact with these stories. Um, which is hard as a critic. I know the first time I read David Hume in undergrad, and even the time I'm reading him earlier this year in grad school, he's very harsh on Christianity, and so it was difficult for me to give him any benefit of the doubt, because I'm like, well, you're just dumb and you hate what I believe, and so I'm gonna say
Sure.
that I'm just gonna hate what you think, and well, it's not beneficial to anybody. It doesn't do him any good. It doesn't do me any good. I'm just wasting my time. And so it's much better to have the intellectual humility to say, maybe he has something that he can teach me, right? Like this is the same sort of
Sure.
idea, that God causes rain to fall on the unjust and the just alike. This, you know, Christians. So there's the question of what does Athens have to do with Jerusalem? Like, is it like if
Hmm.
we're Christians, like we know Christ, we have the highest truth, right? Christ is the way, the truth, and the life. So why? Who cares what Plato has to say? Who cares what
Sure.
Aristotle has to say? Who cares what David Hume has to say, or Hegel, or any of these like non-Christian philosophers? I don't know if Hegel was Christian. I'm not going to put, but like Nietzsche, right? Like, who cares what Nietzsche has to
Sure.
say? The guy said God was dead, so like we can just ignore what he. Well, no, like he was a human. Like he has perhaps something interesting and worthwhile to say to us, and it's our responsibility to shut up and listen for a little bit and try to understand that, and see if there really is anything that does accord with the truth that God has given to us.
Wow. I really don't know what to say to all that because it was so good. I'm just going to reiterate a lot. I would just end up repeating a lot of what you said. No, yeah, I agree, especially with that part there of sometimes you just need to shut up and listen. Sometimes it's good to just take in what other people have to say, even if it is David Hume running down Christians, and at least sit with it and see what he's going to say, what others are going to say, and grow from it. And by the way, anybody who quotes C.S. Lewis gets an automatic re-invite to the show. So good job on that, because we're very pro C.S. Lewis here.
I look forward to
Um,
doing it then.
all right. Before we get out of here, let's go ahead and start wrapping up this episode. But before we get out of here, every once in a while, I like to end the show with what I call a culturally relevant conversation, something that's going on in the world that may or may not have anything to do with what we talked about here on the show. We always try to be somewhat culturally relevant with what we talk about, but to talk about something else. And you definitely seem like the right person to talk about a certain thing that's been going around on the internet,
Okay.
um, where many women have recently discovered that their male significant other, I'll just put it that way, that it is common for us men to think a lot about the Roman Empire, and
Yeah.
women have never spent any time thinking about the Roman Empire, apparently. So, Joe, how often do you think about the Roman Empire?
Yeah, so I'll be honest with you. I think a lot more about the Roman Republic than I do about the Roman Empire.
Okay.
I think, which is fairly frequently, I won't say every day. I think most of the people that do say every day are lying. But,
Are
regardless,
you
right?
familiar with are you familiar with this? I know you said you're on
Yeah.
TikTok, so are you familiar with this trend that's been going on?
Yeah, I've seen it a little bit. I posted about it the other day. Some of the books that I've read about about Rome, and I took a class on the Roman Republic in undergrad. One of my favorite classes. Um, so yeah, I mean, I think especially as Americans, like it's really it would be almost impossible to overstate the influence of the Roman Republic on the founding of our country. So
Hmm.
um, if you're interested at all in like what it means to be an American, what it means to like how can we live, how can we like do any of this stuff together, it would behoove you to at least have a passing interest in the Roman Republic. Why did they do some of the things they do, right? Why do they have some of the consider some of these things as virtuous as they do, right? This idea that a leader would rise up, take authority for a certain amount of time, and then willingly lay it down in return to, right? That's sort of like the thing that like George Washington was trying to emulate. Cincinnatus was a Roman dictator, without all the laden terminology that we have on the term dictator today, right? Like you're just somebody with absolute power, whose job was to come in, but who in theory could have taken power and gone for an indefinite amount of time, decided to lay it down, right? So this like idea of a voluntary, for the most part of America, it was a voluntary 2-term presidency, was something that goes back to the Roman Republic. And there's a whole lot. One of my favorite writers is Cicero. I like his writing, a lot of the things he thinks about. He's one of those is not a Christian Roman, but you could fairly easily see him finding his way to Christianity.
Sure.
I hope. I don't know. I like to think so. One of the like a late Roman Republican writer. So yeah, to answer your question, the empire a little bit, the Republic a bit more.
A bit more. Okay. And you think anybody who's claiming they think about it every single day is probably lying just to get the clicks for their social media?
Yeah, I generally assume that most people who post a lot, especially on like TikTok, that half the stuff that they do is performative anyway. It just like loses the authenticity. Be like, oh, look at my reaction to this. I'm like, how much of that reaction involved you setting up a camera? So it does lose a lot. That's why I post all my fiery tweets with abandon. I just say things and let the hate come back.
There we go. As for me, it's like once a week, because obviously once Claire saw it, she had to ask me. I think it's like once a week. But for me, it always, I don't know why. You had a really good answer there with like understanding America. I always think about like, what did roads look like back then, and the aqueduct system and like buildings. I'm very, for some reason, architecture suddenly and infrastructure suddenly becomes very interesting to me when I think about Rome. And there is a plan to do a Rome series off the back of this ancient Greece series in the future here on My Seminary Life. So knowing that you said Cicero is one of your favorites, we'll circle back for Cicero then at some point.
Oh, all right. Sounds good. I look forward to hearing that one.
All right. Well, on that note, let's go ahead and finish things out. Thank you all for listening to today's episode. Thank you, Joe, for taking time to be here and to record with me. As always, listeners, you can go into the description of this episode to find links to all the important stuff, website, shop, social media, all that good stuff. My Seminary Life is a part of the Anazao Ministries Podcast Network, or AMP for short, where you can check out other great shows like Systematic Geekology, Let Nothing Move You, and the recently added Hockey Night in the Carolinas, because we even have a hockey show here on this Christian podcast network. Ain't it great? Please rate and review the show wherever you get your podcasts, and share this episode with someone that you think should become a Christian humanist. And that is it. Thank you all for listening, and until next time, this is Brandon signing off, reminding you that theology is for everyone, so keep on studying.